Today we got some more actual history about the United States Revolution. We will be reading about the attack on the Wyoming settlements on the western Pennsylvania frontier in 1778 by a group of about 1,200 Tories and 400 Iroquois Indians. Many people, mostly from Connecticut, had settled at Wyoming on the Susquehanna River in the years just before the Revolutionary War. When the war broke out, many of the Wyoming settlers sided with the British, and they left the settlement to live among the Indians before returning to attack. We will be reading from this book, Incidents of Border Life, illustrative of the times and condition of the first settlements in parts of the middle and western states, comprising narratives of strange and thrilling adventure, accounts of battles, skirmishes, and personal encounters with the Indians, descriptions of their manners, customs, modes of warfare, treatment of prisoners, etc., etc. This book was published by Jospeh Pritts all the way back in 1838. Pritts wrote this book to document the unique period during the Revolutionary War, when the western frontier of the United States was exposed to more Indian attacks than ever before. In this story, the majority of the attackers were Tory settlers, and the two men leading the opposing sides were cousins. An account of the dreadful devastation of the Wyoming settlements in July of 1778, from Gordon's History of the American War. So early as the 8th of February 1778, General Schuyler wrote to Congress, "There is too much reason to believe that an expedition will be formed by the Indians against the western frontiers of this state, New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania." The next month he informed Congress that a number of Mohawks and many of the Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas will commence hostilities against us as soon as they can. It would be prudent, therefore, early to take measures to carry the war into their country. It would require no greater body of troops to destroy their towns than to protect the frontier inhabitants. No effectual measures being taken to repress the hostile spirit of the Indians, numbers joined the Tory refugees, and with these commenced their horrid depredations and hostilities upon the back settlers, being headed by Colonel Butler and Brant, a half-blooded Indian of desperate courage, furious and cruel beyond example. Their expeditions were carried on to great advantage by the exact knowledge which the refugees possessed of every object of their enterprise, and the immediate intelligence they received from their friends on the spot. The weight of their hostilities fell upon the fine, new, and flourishing settlement of Wyoming, Pennsylvania, situated on the eastern branch of the Susquehanna River, in a most beautiful country and delightful climate. It was settled and cultivated with great ardor by a number of people from Connecticut, which claimed the territory as included in its original grant from Charles II. The settlement consisted of 8 townships, each 5 miles square, beautifully placed on each side of the river. It had increased so rapidly in population that the settlers sent 1,000 men to serve in the Continental Army. To provide against the dangers of their remote situation, 4 forts were constructed to cover them from the eruptions of the Indians, but it was their unhappiness to have a considerable mixture of royalists among them, and the two parties were actuated by sentiments of the most violent animosity, which was not confined to particular families or places, but creeping within the roofs and to the hearths and floors where it was least to be expected, served equally to poison the sources of domestic security and happiness, and to cancel the laws of nature and humanity. They had frequent and timely warnings of the danger to which they were exposed by sending their best men to so great a distance. Their quiet had been interrupted by the Indians, joined by marauding parties of their own countrymen in the preceding year, and it was only by a vigorous opposition in a course of successful skirmishes that they had been driven off. Several Tories and others not before suspected had then and since abandoned the settlement, and besides a perfect knowledge of all their particular circumstances, carried along with them such a stock of private resentment as could not fail of directing the fury and even giving an edge to the cruelty of their Indian and other inveterate enemies. An unusual number of strangers had come among them under various pretenses, whose behavior became so suspicious that upon being taken up and examined, such evidence appeared against several of them of their acting in concert with the enemy on a scheme for the destruction of the settlements, that about 20 of them were sent off to Connecticut, to there be imprisoned and tried for their lives, while the remainder were expelled. These measures excited the rage of the Tories in general to the most extreme degree, and the threats formerly denounced against the settlers were now renewed with aggravated vengeance. As the time approached for the final catastrophe, the Indians practiced unusual treachery. For several weeks before the intended attack, they repeatedly sent small parties to the settlement, charged with the strongest professions of friendship. These parties, besides attempting to lull the people in security, answered the purposes of communicating with their friends and of observing the present state of affairs. The settlers, however, were not insensible to the danger. They had taken the alarm, and Colonel Zebulon Butler had several times written letters to Congress and General Washington, acquainting them with the danger the settlement was in, and requesting assistance. But the letters were never received, having been intercepted by the Pennsylvania Tories. A little before the main attack, some small parties made sudden eruptions, committed several robberies and murders, and from ignorance or a contempt of all ties whatever, massacred the wife and 5 children of one of the persons sent for trial to Connecticut in their own cause. At length, in the beginning of July, the enemy suddenly appeared in full force on the Susquehanna, headed by Colonel John Butler, a Connecticut Tory and cousin to Colonel Zebulon Butler, the second in command of the settlement. Colonel John Butler was assisted by most of those leaders who had rendered themselves terrible in the present frontier war. Their force was about 1,600 men. Near a fourth were Indians, led by their own chiefs. The others were so disguised and painted as not to be distinguished from the Indians, excepting their officers who, being dressed in regimentals, carried the appearance of regulars. One of the smaller forts, garrisoned chiefly by Tories, was given up or rather betrayed. Another was taken by storm, and all but the women and children massacred in the most inhuman manner. Colonel Zebulon Butler, leaving a small number to guard Fort Wilkesboro, crossed the river with about 400 men and marched into Kingston Fort, whither the women, children, and defenseless of all sorts crowded for protection. He suffered himself to be enticed by his cousin to abandon the fortress. He agreed to march out and hold a conference with the enemy in the open field, at so great a distance from the fort as to shut out all possibility of protection from it. Upon their withdrawing according to their own proposal, in order to the holding of a parley for the conclusion of a treaty, he at the same time marched out about 400 men well armed, being nearly the whole strength of the garrison, to guard his person to the place of parley, which was his distrust of the enemy's designs. On his arrival he found no body to treat with, and yet advanced toward the foot of the mountain, where at a distance he saw a flag, the holders of which, seemingly afraid of treachery on his side, retired as he advanced, whilst he, endeavoring to remove this pretended ill impression, pursued the flag, till his party was thoroughly enclosed, when he was suddenly freed from his delusion by finding it attacked at once on every side. He and his men, notwithstanding the surprise and danger, fought with resolution and bravery, and kept up so continual and heavy a fire for 3/4 of an hour, that they seemed to gain a marked superiority. In this critical moment, however, a soldier, through a sudden impulse of fear or premeditated treachery, cried out aloud, "The colonel has ordered a retreat!" The fate of the party was now at once determined. In the state of confusion that ensued, an unresisted slaughter commenced, while the enemy broke in on all sides without obstruction. Colonel Zebulon Butler and about 70 of his men escaped. The latter got across the river to Fort Wilkesboro. The colonel made his way to Fort Kingston, which was invested the next day on the land side. The enemy, to sadden the drooping spirits of the weak remaining garrison, sent in for their contemplation the bloody scalps of 196 of their late friends and comrades. They kept up a continual fire on the fort the whole day. In the evening, the colonel quitted the fort and went down the river with his family. He is thought to be the only officer that escaped. Colonel Nathan Dennison, who succeeded to the command, fleeing the impossibility of an eventual defense, went with a flag to Colonel John Butler to know what terms he would grant on a surrender, to which application Butler answered, with more than savage phlegm, in 2 short words, "The hatchet!" Dennison, having defended the fort till most of the garrison were killed or disabled, was compelled to surrender at discretion. Some of the unhappy persons in the fort were carried away alive, but the barbarous conquerors, to save the trouble of murder in detail, shut up the rest promiscuously in the houses and barracks, which having set on fire, they enjoyed the savage pleasure of beholding the whole consumed in one general blaze. They then crossed the river to the only remaining fort, Wilkesboro, which, in hopes of mercy, surrendered without demanding any conditions. They found about 70 Continental soldiers who had been engaged merely for the defense of the frontiers, whom they butchered with every circumstance of horrid cruelty. The remainder of the men, with the women and children, were shut up as before in the houses, which being set on fire, they perished altogether in the flames. A general scene of devastation was now spread through all the townships. Fire, sword, and the other different instruments of destruction alternately triumphed. The settlements of the Tories alone generally escaped, and appeared as islands in the midst of the surrounding ruin. The merciless ravagers, having destroyed the main objects of their cruelty, directed their animosity to every part of living nature belonging to them, shot and destroyed some of their cattle, and cut the tongues out of others, leaving them still alive to prolong their agonies. The following are a few of the more singular circumstances of the barbarity practiced in the attack upon Wyoming. Captain Bedlock, who had been taken prisoner, being stripped naked, had his body stuck full of splinters of pine knots, and then a heap of pine knots piled around him. The whole was then set on fire, and his two companions, Captain Ranson and Durgee, thrown alive into the flames, and held down with pitchforks. The returned Tories, who had at different times abandoned the settlements in order to join those savage expeditions, were the most distinguished for their cruelty. In this they resembled the Tories that joined the British forces. One of these Wyoming Tories, whose mother had married a second husband, butchered with his own hands both her, his father-in-law, his own sisters, and their infant children. Another, who during his absence had sent home several threats against the life of his own father, now not only realized them in person, but was himself with his own hands the exterminator of his whole family, mother, brothers, and sisters, and mingled their blood in one common carnage with that of the aged husband and father. The broken parts and scattered relics of families, consisting mostly of women and children, who had escaped to the woods during the different scenes of the devastation, suffered little less than their friends who had perished in the ruin of their houses. Dispersed and wandering in the forests as chance and fear directed, without provision or covering, they had a long tract of country to traverse, and many, without doubt, perished in the woods. So that's it for this story from Incidents of Border Life, which was taken from Gordon's History of the American War. This story certainly makes the Tories and their Iroquois allies look very cruel and barbaric. They killed at least 300 Continental soldiers in this battle. However, I'm now going to read a section from this book, Letters from an American Farmer and Sketches of 18th Century America, by Hector St. John de Crèvecoeur. This account tells a slightly different story about how the Tories treated the women and children after the battle. The body of the aged people, the women and children who were enclosed in the stockade, distinctly could hear and see this dreadful onset, the last scene of which had been transacted close to the very gates. What a situation these unfortunate people were in! Each wife, each father, each mother could easily distinguish each husband and son as they fell. But in so great, so universal a calamity, when each expected to meet the same fate, perhaps they did not feel so keenly for the deplorable end of their friends and relations. Of what powerful materials must the human heart be composed, which could hold together at so awful a crisis? This bloody scene was no sooner over than a new one arose of a very similar nature. They had scarcely finished scalping the numerous victims which lay on the ground, when these fierce conquerors demanded the immediate entrance of the fort. It was submissively granted. Above 100 of them, decorated with all the dreadful ornaments of plumes and color of war, with fierce and animated eyes, presented themselves and rushed with impetuosity into the middle of the area, armed with tomahawks made of brass with an edge of steel. Tears relieved some, involuntary cries disburdened the oppression of others. A general shriek among the women was immediately heard all around. What a spectacle this would have exhibited to the eyes of humanity! Hundreds of women and children, now widows and orphans, in the most humble attitude, with pale, dejected countenances, sitting on the few bundles they had brought with them, keeping their little unconscious children as close to them as possible, hiding by a mechanical instinct the babies of their breasts. Numbers of aged fathers oppressed with the unutterable sorrow, all pale, all trembling, and sinking under the deepest consternation, were looking towards the door, that door through which so many of their friends had just passed, alas, never more to return. Everyone at this awful moment measured his fierce punishment by the degree of revenge which he supposed to animate the breast of his enemy. The self-accusing consciences of some painted to them each approaching minute as replete with the most terrible fate. Many there were who, recollecting how in the hour of oppression they had insulted their countrymen and the natives, bitterly wept with remorse. Others were animated with the fiercest rage. What a scene an eminent painter might have copied from that striking exhibition, if it had been a place where a painter could have calmly sat with palette in his hands. How easily he might have gathered the strongest expressions of sorrow, consternation, despondency, and despair, by taking from each countenance some strong feature of affright, of terror and dismay, as it appeared delineated on each face. In how many different modes these passions must have painted themselves according to each individual's temper, ardent or phlegmatic habits, hurried or retarded circulation of the blood, lengthened or contracted the muscles of his physiognomy. But now a scene of unexpected humanity ensues, which I hasten to describe, because it must be pleasing to peruse and must greatly astonish you, acquainted as you are with the motives of revenge which filled the breasts of these people, as well as with their modes of carrying on war. The preceding part of this narration seems necessarily leading to the horrors of the utmost retaliation. Happily, these fierce people, satisfied with the death of those who had opposed them in arms, treated the defenseless ones, the women and children, with a degree of humanity almost hitherto unparalleled. In the meanwhile, the loud and repeated war shouts began to be re-echoed from all parts. The flames of conflagrated houses and barns soon announced to the other little towns the certainty of their country's defeat. These were the first marks of the enemy's triumph. A general devastation ensued, but not such as we read in the Old Testament, where we find men, women, children, and cattle equally devoted to the same blind rage. All the stock, horses, sheep, etc., that could be gathered in the space of a week, were driven to the Indian towns by a party which was detached on purpose. The other little stockades, hearing of the surrender of their capital, opened their gates and submitted to the conquerors. So that's it for this episode. If there's anything positive to be said about these Tories led by John Butler, it's that they apparently only killed and scalped the fighting men, at least according to this account. These events occurred on July 3rd, 1778, just about 2 years after the Patriots declared independence. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to show on history channels on TV, and because we talk about people who lived much harder lives than we have to, people who suffered extreme hardships in order to provide the peace that we now enjoy today. These are people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support the mission of this channel, then consider becoming a paid member on our Patreon page. Patreon members will have their chosen name listed at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.